8, 10, 9. So welcome to our last session before closing remarks, titled Innovation in Technology and Clinical Design. The focus will be on designing patient tools and solutions to increase participation in clinical trials. I'd like to introduce Hassan Kadhim, Director of Clinical Trial Business Capability and Head of Clinical Innovation here at Bristol Myers Squibb, who will be facilitating this panel discussion. Hassan?
Thank you, Kathy, and welcome everybody, and thank you for being with us with the home stretch. This is the last part of today's great event. What a great event that we all had, getting from patient perspectives to pharma's perspectives, and now we are here talking about patient-centric solutions with my esteemed panel. So before I start with diving right into the conversation, I wanted to introduce our panelists. First with Craig Lipset, who is the founder of Clinical Innovation Partners and the ex-global head of clinical innovation at Pfizer. Craig Serra from Novartis and Kelly McKee from Medidata. Craig, did you want to start with some words?
Who, me?
Craig Lipset.
Well, you know, we have to qualify our Craigs this afternoon. Now, Hassan, it's a pleasure to be here. This is a great topic to dig into. It's certainly a year like, you know, with so much we wish was different, but so many silver linings. And so I'm really looking forward to digging into this topic together and starting to explore ways to make sure that when we're excited about new technology, it's really technology that's with purpose.
Thank you, Craig. Craig Serra, want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Hassan. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you, Craig and Kelly, today. And hello to everyone out there. So my background is mainly within the clinical data world, but the angle of that is within the data and tech ecosystem. How can we start thinking way more about the patient, not less about pharma and service provider, but really an internal operations, but way more about the patient, and how do we actually deploy things that actually make, that are additive in terms of value and not just additive in terms of quantity, but also how we can actually use data to really benefit the patient more so than we ever have before.
Thank you, Craig. And Kelly, you recently made the jump from pharma to the tech sector with Medidata. Can you introduce yourself?
I did, yeah. Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Kelly McKee. I have been talking about how we can improve clinical trials, access, experiences for patients for close to 20 years now. And I really want us to get to a point where patients are ready, willing, and able to choose clinical trials as an option.
Great, thank you, Kelly. And our panel today is to talk about patient-centric tools and solutions to increase participation in clinical trials. And when March hit us and the COVID-19 pandemic really disrupted our industry, it led pharma and the healthcare setting and the healthcare institutions to scramble for solutions, to scramble for how do we get back online with all of our clinical trials. And obviously it put at the forefront innovation in the healthcare arena and clinical innovation within clinical research. And with that, we saw a lot of sites could no longer handle the overwhelming burden of COVID-19 and all, especially when at the peak, a lot of patients were coming in and we had to stop many trials. So I'm wondering, not only did it disrupt our industry, but it also disrupted the way patients perceive clinical trials or even perceive their participation and their expectations for those that are aware of clinical trials. So I wanted to start with the question on what are patients' expectations 6 months from where the pandemic really started today in terms of patient-centric tools and their experience with clinical trials. Craig Lipset, did you want to start with that?
Sure. Hassan, when I think about expectations in general right now, even outside of a clinical trial, even outside of being a patient, I think that for so many of us, though, the world has become more hybrid than ever before. Our kids are in school. At the start of 2020, they were entirely virtual, and now half of our kids are in school and half of them are at home. We went from shopping in supermarkets to being forced to rely on home delivery and other options, and now many of us, it's a little bit of a blend of both. We're seeing the same in all the sectors of our lives, from business meetings to education to commerce. It's really not such a crazy idea that the future of clinical research is equally hybrid. That same idea that hybrid, where I can choose when I'm going to pick up that next grocery order or have my next physician encounter, I'm going to be able to choose the encounter that's right for me where I am in my journey right now. I kind of liked going to the supermarket and picking my own produce once in a while. I never thought I'd like Instacart. Turned out it was okay. And so I think for a lot of us, now that we've been exposed to the fully virtual way of life, we don't want to necessarily all stay there, but we don't want to swing all the way back to where we were, but are looking more forward to a space of having choice. When I think about choice in this environment, to me, it means that participants in research can choose for any given visit what encounter is right for them. Now, that idea sounds frightening for operators in clinical research. The middle name of an RCT is controlled, and we like to have control over our clinical trials for a lot of reasons. We want to manage the quality of our data and its integrity. And when we introduce lots of different ways of doing things, it can feel like chaos. But we also know that we want our studies to get closer and closer to the real world. And for most of our organizations out there, we are leaning more than ever on the rhetoric of being inclusive and engaging with patients. This only embodies that rhetoric more than ever. I know my friend Kelly has some strong feelings on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I know that the study teams that thought about this before the pandemic, really with the patient at the front of mind, they didn't have to slow down or stop enrollment because choice was already built to the protocols. And so I think that we all need to learn from that as a best practice. If you're not injecting somebody with study drug, if you're not doing, a PK with blood draws every 15 minutes for 40 hours, think about, can this be done at a patient's home? And it can be done with home health nurse, video visits, etc. So totally agree. And I'm aligned with Craig that we need to start to introduce choice for clinical trials. And we also really need to think about the experience. So it can't just be a checkbox activity. It can't be just technology that's thrown at a patient. It's really important that we treat participants with the respect that they deserve because they're the ones who are bringing new medicines to market for the rest of us.
Craig, Serra, any particular experiences from your work at Novartis about patient expectations post-COVID?
Yeah, so first, Craig and Kelly hit on some phenomenal points. I think adding on to that, not just from a Novartis perspective, but just experiences in kind of a day-to-day life. What a ride the last 8 or 9 months has been in terms of the clinical trial world and where we are now. We're kind of front and center, not just people that don't know about clinical trials, learning about clinical trials, but really trying to understand that this is the world of how drugs make it to market, and to have the kind of the general public and friends and family go from sort of not understanding that to understanding more about that. I keep sort of referring to as the lemonade from some pretty bad lemons. That is really unbelievable to see. And so I think that this has been the catalyst and will continue to be the catalyst for making patients front and center. I think it really starts with people understanding how trials work. I think it sort of starts with even just understanding the ecosystem in general, and just understanding that this immense amount of work goes on behind the scenes, and not many people know about it. Conversely, from a sponsor perspective, to see that and to see that we're sort of in our own little bubble, that further illustrates how much we need to work with patients and patient advocacy groups, and just from a regular sort of everyday healthcare delivery perspective, how we need to get a lot of information and knowledge sharing to happen, so that people actually know that not only clinical trials are an option, but all these different technologies and all these different things that are going on. We need patients' help to be able to deploy the absolute best kind of solution for a study. And that optionality becomes so unbelievably critical, because what works for one patient doesn't work for another, and vice versa. So I think if this last 8 or 9 months has shown us anything, it's that we need to kind of up our game when it comes to focusing on the patient, probably 5 to 10x. So again, it's been a situation none of us want to be in, but hopefully we can just keep carrying that forward.
Perfect. Thank you. You all touched on very important topics that I wanted to expand on. Craig, you spoke about communication, clinical trial awareness, about optionality, and about just the experience in general and expectations. I know that some of you, as the pharmaceutical industry shifted considerably its attention towards the actual disease, towards COVID-19 and trying to find a vaccine, I know that some of you are or have participated in a COVID-19 vaccine trial. What I wanted to get your perspectives on is, what is the patient experience that you've experienced? And now you have the patient experience and both the pharma perspective. And how do you think it would be better suited to change in improving the experience through maybe better patient-centric solutions? So I know, Kelly, you have participated. Craig, I've seen your posts on LinkedIn. Any of you want to take a stab at this?
I'm happy to start. So first of all, it's really my honor to be able to participate in a COVID vaccine study, and it makes me feel really good that I'm part of the solution. So with that being said, there are lots of things that could have been optimized in my experience, which is continuing to be ongoing. And I'm not going to say who the sponsor is or what the study is, but all of the visits are in the hospital, 100%, but I'm not getting a vaccine at every single visit. So like, that's the first thing. And the second thing, I think, is really the theme, that it was very obvious to me from being a pharma insider that the study was pushed as fast as it could to be deployed. And so some of the things that were missing were like those special touches to make patients feel really appreciated and that they were part of the solution. For example, I have multiple CLIN cards. And so I'm thankful that I get a patient visit stipend, right? Not everybody does, but there's sort of like, there's money all over the place in various cards. And the thermometer that they gave me takes 2 minutes and 40 seconds to take my temperature. I think it's from like the 1990s. I was saying the 1980s, but then somebody reminded me that that would have had real mercury in it, and it doesn't. So there's that. But it's just like those little things that are additive in your participant experience. So while I would do it again, I am doing it, but in a heartbeat, I'm really happy that I'm doing it. If I were to design the patient experience for my particular study, there's lots of things that I would have done differently.
Perfect. Thank you. Craig, anything to add on that?
Yeah, so Callie and I are in the same study, I'm fairly certain. So we're working with the same sponsor, different sites. We have, I think, slightly different experiences. Mine has been a bit more, I think, positive from a kind of site healthcare delivery perspective, but agreed 100% that, you know, all the visits are in person. It's not terribly inconvenient. My car did get stolen prior to visit 2. I was offered a ride by the PI to be able to get down there, but if I needed to have a telemedicine visit, I couldn't have gotten a telemedicine visit. If I needed the home nursing for the injection, I couldn't have gotten that. So hopefully people's cars don't get stolen, but there's things like that come up that you could easily see that if we did have that optionality, that would be kind of the time to use it. And I guess I just see that there was a urgency to getting these trials up and running. The enrollment, we sort of wish we could see this kind of enrollment with essentially every other trial on the planet. It's just incredible how quickly patients are being enrolled, but the actual experience of the trial, we're talking about technology that sometimes doesn't work, sometimes it does. We're talking about some of the operational pieces that don't seem like they mesh with everyday life. I shouldn't be able to be sitting in a waiting room ordering something from Amazon that is essentially guaranteed to get to my house the next day, and then get a thermometer that takes 3 minutes to actually work. So the healthcare delivery aspect, I think, was exceptional and great, but the operational component surrounding sort of the patient experience wasn't so great. But I don't know if that differs too much from, I think, what we're here to discuss from the last 10 or 20 years in pharma.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. And you all touched on the concept of optionality. And obviously, once the pandemic hit, the biggest topic of the hour became decentralized trials in terms of technology for clinical research. And everybody suddenly became more and more aware of the advent of decentralized trials, whereas 2 years ago, we were still doing the legwork and the evangelizing on the importance of moving into decentralized trials. But you spoke about optionality, and decentralized trials per se if they're not designed to provide options, they don't necessarily provide options. You either have the full traditional, or even when you say hybrid, it's visit 3, visit 5, and visit 9 as hybrid, and everything else is. So you're not really providing flexible options. You're just providing a different way of doing the trial. But what we're saying when we say options is really providing it at the pace of the patient's life, so that they can do visit 2 from home if they have to, or if they can, or do it in the clinic if they prefer seeing the physician in the clinic. And in my experiences in trying to infuse optionality, when I discuss with teams internally and externally, I think we always, and Craig, you mentioned it, it's all about control. It's a controlled clinical trial. So how do we provide optionality, as we say, without necessarily losing control or the perception of losing control, and still having the clinical trial perform what it's there to perform? Craig Lipset, you want to walk us through this?
Hassan, I think the first thing to me is to make sure that we're all shooting for the same kind of stretch goal here. And I think you described it really well there. For quite a while, I would hear folks describe the journey being from brick and mortar studies today to a hybrid sort of world to a desired end state of a fully remote, fully virtual trial. Now, I spent a lot of time with different patient groups and patient advocates and patient panels, and I've never heard patients consistently come back and say to me, I want no more investigator site to visit. To me, the only people that aspire to fully virtual as the desired end state are the technologists that believe the technology could lead us there. And while it can, that's not where patients are necessarily leading us. And so to me, the first challenge that I see around achieving that vision, Hassan, is I don't know that we yet have the systems that can make switches easy. I don't think we yet have the systems that let me log in and say that for my next visit, I need to switch it from in-person to video because my car was just stolen. We don't have those types of platforms yet because I don't think we've yet been in a place of articulating to the technology community that this is the desired end state that we want to aim for, or that we need a connective layer so that we might have an ecosystem of great solutions out there, but we need this sort of routing layer that can enable the patient to have that kind of choice. I think part of it is the language that we use. When we talk about a decentralized clinical trial, it implies there is one model for what is a decentralized trial. We call it a decentralized trial almost, it just implies that to be the case. But in fact, what we have is a toolkit of decentralized research methods. And the real magic is how do we take those different decentralized tools and look at our protocol needs, our patient needs, and the feasibility around it and be able to incorporate them. So I do see that there is a next generation of tools, Hassan, that we maybe don't have quite yet. But I think the other half to your question is around data quality and data integrity when we have this type of flexibility. There are some things I think we can have a high degree of confidence around. We can acquire a blood draw here, or we can acquire a blood draw there as long as the person is a phlebotomist or other qualified individual, or maybe because we're using certain awesome new technology that I can slap on my arm and draw it myself. But there's other things that maybe feel a little more daunting to us. Can I do a 6-minute walk test in the clinic or at home? That gets a lot more challenging. And that's where study teams need to invest in better endpoints, leveraging digital tools that can let them capture the data that's needed in better and smarter ways. When we're trapping ourselves by relying on legacy outdated endpoints, it will make it forever harder for us to enable that kind of flexibility and take a measurement and be able to capture it from anywhere.
Perfect. Thank you, Craig. Kelly, Craig, the other Craig, anything to add to that?
I would just add that the technology really needs to be tested by patients before it's deployed. Hamilton would never go on stage without practicing first, like a dress rehearsal, but yet protocols are initiated without those run-throughs first, and technology is exactly the same. And so, one of the things that we do is we have a group of patient advocates who test everything out first. And so I think that that's an easy step that anybody can really do. It does take some upfront planning, but if you think about it from a patient's perspective, you're going to do UAT. Nobody says, oh, we don't need UAT, but they say, oh, we don't need to test out with patients. We know that it works. We did UAT. So let's test it out with the people who are using it every day.
Yeah, and just on that same note, Kelly, I guess I look at things as we have to have a very robust and diligent look and walkthrough when we build a protocol, or when we write a protocol, what that's actually going to mean for the patient. I know that happens now. Is it at scale? Is it enough? I'm not quite sure. But I would say that when writing a protocol and envisioning how we're going to run a trial, we have to put ourselves from the viewpoint of a patient. And as you said, simply speaking to patients and advocacy groups is such a huge advantage in terms of getting a much better experiment run, essentially, that really takes into account who we're really looking after. I think also the other piece of this is, and this is purely my opinion, but we often look to decreasing costs when we run our clinical trials. Perhaps we, on a study level, increase cost if it's focused on being focused on the patient. Because I think we could hypothesize that get what you pay for mentality could get us to a much better place in terms of studies being run more quickly, which has advantage, obviously, for patients, but has advantage for service providers and pharma companies alike. So I think instead of maybe having a mindset of, well, how do we decrease a little cost here, decrease cost here, maybe we need to spend a little bit more, and we'll actually get an enormous return on that investment downstream.
These are great ideas, and with everybody speaking, I have another question that I want to ask you. So I'm going to prioritize, and I'll catch on that last piece, Craig, that you mentioned, which is the focus on cost, and maybe we should focus more on improving the patient experience. And that reminds me of a study a few years ago that was done with a collaboration of CITI, the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative, that quantified the value of patient experience. And how patient experience can actually improve the overall outcome of a study. So do you think that's a missing piece in the way we design our studies, actually quantifying patient experience, measuring it, and providing its real value? And we focus too much on cost, and when it's about cost, obviously we want to decrease costs. So do we think that patient experience actually gives companies a competitive advantage, that it's actually crucial to give it more focus?
That's a hard one, Hassan. I think that there are possibly direct and probably indirect costs that we can demonstrate. And many organizations have looked to try to measure that just as a way to get themselves to commit to scale. I think that you can look at the potential for direct cost savings related to patient recruitment, patient retention, perhaps maybe around compliance with a protocol. I think, to Craig's point, I'd be very cautious about looking for direct cost savings. It's usually a decision that I think a sponsor needs to make with eyes wide open. Am I introducing this new approach to save money or to improve experience? But if it's about a direct cost savings, I think most sponsors will be disappointed. So I think that there is that element of maybe influencing recruitment and retention, but then there are the softer measures that still matter to large organizations around reputation and trust, which most large pharma companies are very concerned with today, and rightfully so. And inside of the R&D organization and drug development, there are very few things that we can directly impact when it comes to reputation and trust. This is one of them, and it's our opportunity to make that contribution. Sometimes we hope we have leaders, though, that will look back and say we're going to do it because it's the right thing to do. But that's hard, we know, when there are quality improvement initiatives and other measurements that may be important in the regulatory filing. And while I think many in the outside world may think pharma just has the money, just go and do it all, we do know we operate as in a resource-constrained environment within these studies.
And Kelly, earlier you mentioned the technology components, and Craig, you also mentioned that in the past, most of those that would promote a fully remote, fully virtual option were probably more the tech companies knowing that the technology is there. And maybe 2-3 years ago, I started realizing the role of the technology company, not just as a tech provider, but as an advisor to sponsors in driving this change. Kelly, I'd love to get your perspective, having spent time in pharma and now some time on the tech side. What do you think is the role of the technology provider in improving the patient experience and improving the outcomes for clinical trials today?
Yeah, I don't think that it should be the thought of individuals who work on the technology or provider side that it's really the role of sponsors or CROs to drive patient engagement and improvements in patient experiences. It really is incumbent upon all of us to ensure that the products that we're providing to patients optimize their experiences. And so when you're designing an ePro, think about what it looks like to the patient and how it could contribute to a beautiful experience for her. It might be easier to code something that takes, 5 clicks of yes or I confirm, but that's not easier for the patient, and it just gets to be old. And not a fun experience. So, I think that it's really, it takes a village, right? It takes a village to raise a child, and it takes a village to improve patient experiences. And I think we also need to start measuring patient experiences. So that's something that we really haven't done. We talk about improving patient experiences, but we really don't have that baseline of what is the patient experience now in clinical trials, so that when we make these changes, then we can measure again and we can see if those changes are beneficial. And I think that would then go back to the ROI that Craig brought up. And I only have to say Craig, and I'm talking about both of them. So thanks for making it easy for me here.
Yeah, no, great comment. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Hassan. I was going to say just a couple of thoughts on the last couple questions. So the first piece about the ROI. So not only I think there can be an ROI in any given trial by spending on certain areas related to patient experience, to be able to claw back some cost related to that trial, perhaps on things like protocol amendments, which are $300,000 to $500,000 a pop in a phase 2B or 3A or 3B trial. So we're talking about concrete costs within a study, but also from a pharmaco perspective, time to market. So clawing back that time to market would wipe away any cost that you could possibly throw into any given trial, because you're talking about such a scale difference. But the second piece is you had asked about competitive advantage, and I have fairly strong feelings on the fact that even if it is a competitive advantage for any given company to be more patient-centric, I sure hope it doesn't become one, because that would mean that things like this become far less prevalent and people start operating in silos. There's far less information sharing and knowledge sharing and collaboration, which ultimately benefits everyone, in my opinion, but specifically benefits the patient. So if it is a competitive advantage, I certainly hope that the collaboration will continue. But I think that anytime there is something that's an advantage in the business world, you tend to sort of tighten up in terms of knowledge sharing. So I hope we can continue, no matter where it lands, to just commit to collaboration.
No, that's a great message, Craig. I wanted to move on to, I see there's a lot of chatter on the chat line, and there's a question that just came that I think is relevant for the next part of the discussion, which is the site's role. As we think of innovating, oftentimes we do a pilot, we sometimes think of scaling and changing, but oftentimes we innovate for the patient. And we know that the patient works directly with the site. And for the patient's experience in that study, it all happens with an investigator or with their study team. It's very rare that, or very seldom, that they work at all with a sponsor. So how do we improve the patient experience by improving the site experience? What are we not doing right that we can immediately impact? Any of your perspectives would be awesome.
Hassan, years ago, we did a hackathon with the innovation team from Delta Airlines, because it felt like an airline traveler and a clinical trial participant, that there was just a lot in common between the journeys. And at one point we said, oh, but woe is us on the clinical trial side, because I don't employ the investigator site staff. I can't control their journey. And they said, well, we don't employ all the staff in an airline traveler's journey as they're going through TSA or going through the gate check or picking up their baggage. And it really validates your point that there's only so much of the experience that we can control with an app. When you get on an airplane flight, there's only so much that United Airlines app or Delta app is really going to do to improve your experience as compared to all the human interactions that you're having. And to your point, if we're not supporting our investigator sites and our site staff in order to give them what they need, the resources and support that they need. And even to Andrew's point in the chat thread here, if there are opportunities for us to harmonize what that looks like, so we're introducing less chaos and noise to them, but ultimately that is going to be what drives the experience. Yes, there are some great enabling tools, whether that can improve how I'm engaging with my site staff via distance. Maybe there's some digital tools that can help scale and amplify the great capabilities of our site staff. But in recent years, we've had so much appropriate energy on patient experience. Maybe we are overlooking the experience of our site staff and what a critical role that plays in delivering the overall experience boost we're seeking.
Yeah.
And just to add on to that,
go ahead.
I was going to say, just to add on to that, I mean, a specific example from my world is that we're actually looking at and actively improving our organizational structure related to how we run trials, the way that we design them, the way that we execute them, the way that clinical data kind of flows through the trial, and critically, the site and patient experience. And so when you commit to things like organizational structure that has a focus on the site and the patient, and in my mind, I see them tethered often. I think that that's an enormous step towards just understanding someone's journey, understanding what someone else is actually going through, understanding the lens that someone else is looking at. because that so often gets kind of pushed down and pushed to the side. So I see things like that actually happening more and more, and I think that can be nothing but good.
I'm going to talk about it from my perspective and participating in my trial. So I was not the first patient to be randomized at this site, but I was the first to use the e-consent. And both the study coordinator and it was a sub-investigator, not the PI, who was there for my first visit. PI was there for other visits. They said, we hate e-consent. We would much rather just do paper, but they're making us do this. So they gave me the tablet. I watched a pretty video. I went through each screen, and evidently I read too quickly because they didn't think I was really reading it. So I got to the end, and then the e-consent broke. So I had to go back to the paper anyway. And so it's those types of experiences that are not only frustrating for the patient, but even more so for the site. So I do think it's really important that we think about the site experience. And yeah, we need to think about how we make it easier for them. Going into a million different portals and websites with different passwords that you have to change at different times, that is a pain, and it's not a great experience for them. So I totally agree with, what you guys are saying about the need to really put some effort in here.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much we have to do on the patient experience front, and it's clearly that the site experience is so tightly linked with that that we cannot and should not ignore it. This morning, David Leventhal, a good friend of mine, and I'm sure was someone who you worked very closely with, Craig, spoke about patient data returns. And maybe 10, 15 years ago, patient data returns was not really a thing because the technology wasn't there to enable it. But the technology has evolved. And the expectations, the human expectations when they deal with any industry is that they have access, they have the right and the access to their data. I wanted to open the question as to, is this the next thing that we have to really put our attention to really improve the patient experience as we are going more and more remote, more decentralized, more technology-enabled clinical trials? Should we not put an extra emphasis on returning these data back to the patients in a meaningful way that they can use as part of their electronic health record and journey?
Everyone from a sponsor on this call, from a CRO, from a tech company knows that when we're planning and designing our studies, we're doing it for deliverables. We're thinking about the deliverables to our management, deliverables to regulators, deliverables in terms of publications. The next layer, Hassan, to your point, is to drive the deliverables that patients deserve back from the study. The results, their individual data, and where the two converge. Now, if we think that patient experience interventions during the trial are hard to get financial buy-in for, we're really going to have to roll up our sleeves when it comes to giving people back something after the study is over, to acknowledge that they existed and that we owe them something after they're done giving to us everything that we needed from them. That's going to be a challenge for a lot of organizations. I think that the way we're going to have to rely on this is to look at our existing technology platforms, our existing data partners, and work together with them to find ways that can make this easy. And the easier we can make it, the way that it almost becomes an opt-out instead of an opt-in for pharma companies, because it can be implemented that readily, then it becomes a no-brainer. But when it's going to require budget and create friction, it's going to be uphill. There are companies, I believe, and this is unfortunate to Craig's point, that will set themselves apart by doing this, doing it well, and their studies will look like differentiators, but they don't have to, and it is something that everybody can engage and embrace around.
Thank you, Craig. Any other perspective on that? Craig and Kelly?
I'm aligned with Craig.
Yeah, it's good when Craig goes first, because then the other Craig just say, I agree with Craig.
All right, let me amend that. Heck with patients. Why give them back their data? What are they going to do with it anyway? What a great way to close.
Right.
Yeah.
With that,
Got that on Twitter, everyone?
Hassan, I would actually say very quickly that at a minimum, I think that the data, and you mentioned about being part of the electronic medical record, at a minimum, those data need to be included, even if the patient isn't going to use it for him or herself. That that those data can be included in the larger healthcare data kind of ecosystem. So again, even if someone's not going to specifically use it for themselves, that it gets included so other physicians in their healthcare delivery can have access to that. Obviously, from a consenting point of view, patients need to consent, but assuming that to be true, I think that's probably a very good, I think, first step.
Yeah, it's the right thing to do. We talked about the right thing to do before. It's patients are giving of themselves. They're giving of their data. It's the right thing to do to return it to them. And, technology companies can certainly help with this and make it easy. Hassan, you asked, is this the next thing we should focus on? I think we need to focus on it all. We need to focus on improving the experience, not just the experience in e-consent or the experience in ePro or the experience in patient communications. It's the clinical trial experience, and we need to improve it.
Absolutely. And the right thing to do, there's a lot of right things to do that we are not necessarily doing very well. And clearly there's a lot of work for all of us in the pharma industry and in the clinical research world. I heard this morning the patient that spoke about missed opportunities in communication, and clearly with all the technology solutions out there and deployed in the right manner, we can solve some of these issues that seem so simple and obvious, but we have in some cases missed the mark with that. With that brings us to our home stretch. It was a great conversation. I think we spoke about options, which I'm hoping when we reach 2021, 2022, we're no longer talking about the need to do it, but we're actually all putting some plans to actually make options available for our patients and our sites in our clinical trials. I'd like to thank you all, my esteemed panelists, for a great conversation. I wish we had more time, and I'm sure everybody here had more questions as I see.
And Hassan, I want to tell you, I'm sorry for jumping in, but you do have a little bit of extra time, I've been told. So if there are questions or if there's something else you want to put out there to your team, we do have some additional time till 4:15. We're
awesome.
4:05. I'm sorry, 4:05.
4:05 is in 2 minutes, so let's
yeah. No, they're telling me otherwise now. So
perfect. So let me throw in one as closing arguments for this panel. Craig Lipset, you mentioned it briefly in one of your comments about pharmaceutical companies' reputation, which is really, really important in my eyes, and I think for everyone that works in the industry. And in a Gallup poll that I read last year, and I don't know how much of it has changed since COVID and all the attention that we're getting on clinical research, pharma was at the very bottom of public perception. Does any one of you here think that part of the problem that we can actually, what is the impact that we can do is by improving the patient experience in clinical trials? Obviously, that's not the only thing, but what can we do to improve the pharmaceutical companies and industry's reputation of all the good work that we're doing, maybe in improving the interactions of patients in our studies? Any thoughts there?
I think experience alone is good, but insufficient. When you think about why people perceived us this way, I don't think it's because they think we're not doing a nice job of taking care of people in studies. I don't even think they know studies exist for the most part. But I think that there is a perception that there is a lack of trust and that's linked to a lack of transparency. And so this last point that you just got us into, Hassan, around getting people back their data is one of the greatest things we could do in terms of trust and transparency in order to boost reputation. My belief is that inside of the R&D organization, it's probably the best thing that we can do in order to move the barometer here, because it's perceived that we're hiding something. And so the best way for us to respond to it is to be open and share. And the stakeholder we should begin sharing with first is the patient in the trial themselves.
That's a great reflection, Craig. I know we're at 4:05, but I want to give the chance to the other panelists to give their last words. Craig or Kelly?
Craig, why don't you go?
Sure.
Oh, giving it to others.
No, so first off, thanks for the last 45 minutes, the panelists, and to those listening. In terms of our reputation in this industry, I'm going on almost 19 years in the industry. To a person, I can say that this industry is filled with incredibly smart and well-meaning and good people that are trying their best for their companies, for their families, for their friends, for patients. I can say that I literally don't know one person in the industry that would fall under a reason to mistrust. I think that comes from different things, maybe outside of R&D, perhaps from just other parts of the whole value chain of a pharma company, especially with things like pricing and what we see in terms of advertisements on TV. If that's the true face of pharma, then I probably wouldn't trust it either. But we know it's not. So I'm not particularly surprised by that statistic. Even a few years back, I think we were second to politicians, essentially. So I'm not surprised by that. But in terms of how do we change that? For almost 18 years, when people would ask what I did for a living, I would just say clinical trials and move on with the conversation because I thought I'd rather just talk about them. And I have no trouble talking, as you can tell. The last 8 or 9 months, the amount that people, whoever would ask and whoever would listen, have gotten to know about the clinical trial process and how this exists within the larger healthcare delivery system has been tremendous. I think people that I'm friends with and my family probably gotten to hear way more about the clinical trial world than they ever expected. So the point is there's this knowledge sharing component that those within the pharma industry and service and tech providers, we have, I think, a responsibility to actually deliver that knowledge to people that don't really know, as Craig mentioned, don't even know about clinical trials, that we have a responsibility to actually share the reality of what goes on. Because I think there'd be far more trust when you realize what really goes on versus what you're sort of perceiving to actually happen within our industry.
So Colonel Eli Lilly said this quote that I love. It's take what you have and make it better and better. That's what we need to do. We can't be satisfied with the status quo. We need to learn from what's happened with COVID and how, setting up trials the way we always didn't work anymore. And so it's all of our jobs to take what we have today and keep making it better and better for the patient, for the patients who will eventually get the medicines, for our sites, and hopefully that will move the needle.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, the two Craigs, for great perspectives and reflections. This was a great panel to moderate on my end, and the conversation was amazing as I see the chatter and reflections from our attendees. With that, Kathy, this is where I pass the baton. Thank you for giving us the extra minutes and take us to the finish line.
Thank you, Hassan, for leading that, and thank you, panel members. It's very insightful and discussion. As we approach the close of what has been a really informative and engaging patient experience summit, we'll be moving to the final acknowledgements from our Panagora host, Doug Lavender, followed by some closing remarks provided by Lorena Curry, the head of diversity strategy here at BMS. So on the downstretch, guys, I'm going to stop now and move on. Thanks.